So, welcome to the third instalment of a conversation with Graeme. I'm delighted this week that we're going down a completely different route, and I've got Dr. Paula Watson with me today. So, Paula, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me, Graeme.
So, we're going to enter what my world would say maybe the dark side of science, the murky world of sports psychology, or in your background, mainstream psychology. I think it's fair to say that your early research career was based upon the goals research, which is getting our active lifestyles started, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about today. And I know that was a really successful program of work that had a major influence in reducing BMI in children. And I know that following on from that now, a passion of yours now is using your expertise to actually change behaviour in frontline health professionals. I just wonder if we could start off by maybe telling us a little bit more about that early work on the goals research. And I think I'm right in saying that was mentored by our close friend Lindsay Dugdale, who was a real pioneer in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindsay started off the goals research with some paediatricians actually from Alder Hey Hospital. So this was back in 2003, 2004, when childhood obesity was becoming a real issue, but we didn't really know what to do about it. So during that time, from that point, we saw lots of different childhood obesity treatment programs prop up. And goals was one of these. I remember I started my research post at John Moores in 2005. There was just me sitting in an office going, where do we start with this? And then, 2-3 years down the line, we were running the Child Weight Management Service for Liverpool, commissioned by the then Liverpool Primary Care Trust. And we were seeing we saw over about 400 families over the time we were running it. But the whole thing about the approach to that research was that we were developing and evaluating the programme together, hand in hand, continuously over a series of years. So we were funded year on year by the Primary Care Trust to deliver this intervention. At the same time, we were developing, we were gathering research data to learn what we were doing well, what we could improve on, to try and develop an effective intervention. So what Lindsay taught me throughout this, and her key message from the start, was it was absolutely crucial to involve the families themselves in developing the intervention and the people that were eventually going to make use of this research. A bottom-up approach, you might kind of call it. So yeah, it was a big learning process over that time. I was kind of a researcher stroke practitioner over that time, which brought its own challenges, but also a lot of benefits. And yeah, I know might have more questions to ask about that, but that's a snapshot of what we were doing over those years.
So if we go right back to the basics then, we know that childhood obesity is a problem, and unfortunately we know that it's increasing. I'm sure I read that there was a statistic that 1 in 10 children go to primary school obese, and unfortunately 1 in 5 come out of primary school obese. And if we look at just being overweight, I think that figure's 1 in 5 going into primary school, 1 in 3 leaving primary school. Why is it such a problem?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think a lot of it is to do with society and the changes that we've seen in society over the past few decades. So that this is both, I guess we call it like an obesogenic environment. So this is both in terms of the availability of food, fast foods everywhere, even things down to when you work. Actually, they've changed this more in recent years. But at the time when we were running goals, every supermarket till you went to, or shopping till they went to, there was loads of shops there tempting you. That has improved. In terms of physical activity, obviously, and particularly when it comes to children, which has got worse in recent years, the sedentary pastimes, sitting on games, computer games in particular, transport, more of us using cars, everything becoming automated. So these are all making it a lot more challenging for people to be physically active and eat healthily. But there's also a side of it where it's become more normal for children to be overweight, which then makes it more challenging for parents and for health professionals to actually recognise when a child is overweight. Because to be overweight, a child doesn't even need to look that visually overweight. So a 5-year-old who has my BMI, which would be about 21, which is healthy for an adult, would be extremely obese, because 5-year-olds are meant to be skin and bones. So we've lost our perception. Like when you and I were at school, there was probably that one child. We can probably both remember that one child in our class who was overweight. And nowadays, as you just said from the start, showed from the statistics, it is far more than that. By the time children are leaving primary school, 1 in 3 children are overweight or obese.
Wow. So all the research is there to say this, and you sent me a few papers to have a read to get myself a bit more clued up in this area. And what I love about the psychology is all different quotes. We don't have enough quotes, I don't think, in physiology. But one that jumped out was how many studies into obesity is it going to take to build one cycle path to get children to school? And it was almost making the argument, I think, should we stop researching? Is it now all about interventions? Should we, or is the research still important?
So yeah, I really like that quote. It was from a lady called Nicole Lavery, who is a community advisor, so not a researcher, someone frustrated. And I think the message that she was actually trying to make was a bit more about, you keep telling us what to do, but are you actually going to support us to do this? Because she was making the issue that the environment is just not supportive of these things. Yeah. But I use that quote in a paper I wrote because actually what we find a lot, I work a lot with public health departments, with local NHS, and they need a solution now. They can't wait. I mean, there's papers out there that suggest it takes something like 17 years for some research studies to actually reach practice. They can't wait 17 years for something that we suspect. We know that healthy eating is good for us. We know that physical activity is good for us. So why do we need lots of randomized controlled trials first before we put this into practice? So my argument there is actually it's not either research or practice. The two need to go hand in hand, and we need to be looking at the issue that we've had, I think, with behavioural medicine and behavioural science is that we're trying to apply a traditional scientific model that was designed for drug and pharmacological interventions to human behaviour. And human behaviour is hugely complex, and there's a lot of, we can't have that level of control. We can have that level of control. A lot of the physiological studies we do within the labs are very heavily controlled. We make sure that people come in for their 3 exercise sessions a week. We put heart rate monitors on to make sure they're working at a certain percentage of heart rate max. We can't have that control in interventions in the community, which is where we get this issue, where we've got all these tightly controlled efficacy studies we've done in the labs, but then these don't easily translate to what happens in the real world. So my argument, and Lindsay Dugdale's argument that I've adopted and am driving forward still, is that actually we need alternative research methodologies that allow us to develop and test these interventions in practice.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I just want to build on that a little bit. I read that 17 years quote, and I don't have a bit in my heart sunk or what happened when I read that, but the research that we're doing could take 17 years before it actually then, gets into the community. Why does it take so long? Well,
I think looking at these papers that report this as well, it's a little misleading because they look at lots of different types of studies. So it's health interventions. So some of them might be drug interventions, whereas some of them might be more exercise-based or behaviour change interventions. But actually, if you think about it, if you think about how long it takes to do a research study to start with, okay, you need to write your grant, you need to bring your funding in, then need to set up the study, get your ethics approval, do your first phase of the study. And a lot of, again, the traditional scientific model was that you do your basic research first with animals, you then do your research with human participants, then clinical research. It then takes some time for that to be published and get it into the guidelines. And then certainly when it comes to behavioural science, there's no promise then that if something's in the guidelines, it actually happens in practice. So most of those studies, I think, were referring to more drug type interventions anyway, but it's really through all the steps you need to take. And actually, it's the huge gap between what happens at that early stage in research to what we actually need in practice. And which I'm arguing in terms of behavioural science, we really need to be developing and testing these interventions in the situation with which they're going to be actually applied.
Yeah, I wonder if a problem as well, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that there's still, I think, when it comes to diet and exercise, some people who are yet to be convinced that it is important to be at the right weight and to have a physical activity. And if we put an analogy here with smoking, I don't think there's anyone who these days doesn't accept that smoking is bad for you, yet people still smoke, and we can't really get people to stop smoking. You know, some can, obviously, and there's some good interventions, but people still start to smoke and don't stop. Do you think that there's some issue that we need to be really clear with the advice when it comes to diet and exercise? And maybe my world of nutrition and physiology, maybe we've confused things a little bit with a lot of the caveats that we put on the research?
I do feel, I feel for the lay public out there, to be honest, because I know, and certainly, nutrition is incredibly confusing for people. And there's so many arguments. I mean, as a non-nutritionist, but someone obviously when I was running the goals program, one of the things that we did have was we had a nutrition element to it, and I learned about nutrition a lot myself during that time. We were following very much the NHS guidance, for instance, but I know that differs from some of the advice you might give in sports nutrition, for instance. At times there's different camps. And I do think it's confusing for the public, and something that a real bugbear of mine is what the way the media picks up the chance stuff that the media picks up on and then promotes a headline that then can be extremely damaging sometimes, because it might just be, it happens to be a paper that they thought was sexy and something that would make a difference. And actually we then have to rush to do all those radio interviews, anything that we can, to try and get the correct messages out there. So I do think messages, certainly around diet, also exercise and physical activity, are confusing for the public. And I see that as part of my responsibility as an academic to try and get those more appropriate messages out there.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when you said that about nutrition. You know, the mad thing is that the vast majority of sensible people, now there's always them on the outside, but the very vast majority of sensible people, I think, agree on 90% of nutrition. And it's the 10% that gets all the media time. You know, I think most of us agree that, you know, high quality fruits and vegetables are, you know, it should be a mainstream of a diet, that lean fish and meats and things like that, you know, are healthy, and trying to get a balance between energy intake and energy expenditure is important. Most of us all agree on that, but for some reason, it's that minute detail that everybody argues about, which adds so much confusion. And then actually the basic message of getting the right amount of calories in to match your expenditure and making sure that your plate is full of vibrant vegetables and, you know, everything, it just gets lost, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, look, moving on a little bit from that, but I guess a continuation, is that there seems to be like, maybe we're not asking the right questions as scientists, and maybe us scientists need to have a little bit of a look at ourselves. And what I'm getting at here is that gap between traditional science and the public health needs. We've typically said there's maybe two strands of research, isn't there? There's basic science and then applied research that's trying to translate. Do you think we've got a bit of a problem in this field, and should we be doing a little bit more effort as scientists on trying to do translational research and work with the end user to ask the right questions?
Well, yeah, I definitely think so. I think there is, in fact, so it's always been a part of my research career since, I mean, I guess I started being a practitioner before I started becoming a researcher, but it's always been crucial to me that we are working with those people, the people that are going to deliver the intervention and the people that are going to receive the intervention. And I think sometimes there's been too much like, let's see if it works first and then let's take it to them. Whereas actually we need to involve those people from the start, because if we're developing something that works, okay, it's perfect in that efficacy trial in the lab, and it has no relevance to these people in the real world, it's not going to get anywhere. And I mean, recently I have been working on some more multidisciplinary projects within our school as well, working with Dick Tyson and with Anton Wagenmakers, and to combine the physiology and the psychology. And it's really interesting. I can see we're learning a lot from each other about the different ways that we approach interventions, actually, and about the value of really involving these service users, participants from the start, and thinking about these feasibility issues.
Yeah. And I guess a similar question is, I've seen you've wrote a few papers on something called co-production, which I think involving the end user, and something I know that you feel strongly about. You just want to expand on what this means and what we can do with a better understanding of co-production?
So co-production, it's funny really, because you see this go through, it's become a very fashionable term the last couple of years, as though it's something new. Whereas actually it's been around for years, and everything that I've described with the goals program development has all been about co-production. And essentially it is, to me, it's about working with the practitioners, the commissioners, the service users, all together with the academics to develop these interventions together. So whilst as academics we will bring the evidence base, the theory behind it, crucially the practitioners will bring that, what we call craft knowledge, the knowledge of what works on the ground. The service users will bring what's important to them. And an example of a project we've done recently with this is in the GP exercise referral scheme in Liverpool. So for anyone that's not aware, exercise referral is where people, inactive individuals with health risk or health conditions, can be referred by a health professional to receive a programme of exercise. Now, in the UK, this has been going since the 1990s and was rolled out prematurely, in a sense, before we really had a lot of evidence for it. So it was rolled out, they're running all over the country, estimated 600 plus schemes, and they tend to entail, you go and see your GP, they signpost you to the local gym. The local gym will give you an induction and they'll give you 12 to 16 weeks of subsidised or free exercise. Unfortunately, there's not been a lot of behaviour change support in these schemes. Now, these schemes work well for some people, not so well for others, and part of this is because there's such variation in the schemes across the country. So what we wanted to do locally was to try and see, well, can we improve the existing model within the existing infrastructure and resources, so that we're better supporting people to change their physical activity behaviour, rather than they just go and get a free gym programme for 12 weeks and half of them drop out halfway through, half of them drop out once it stops being free and not getting any further. So we had groups literally in a room together. We had commissioners, GPs, patients, exercise practitioners, literally in a room together for a series of workshops. So this was Ben Buckley's PhD, who started as a physiologist, but is quickly becoming more public health and psychology. We developed, or we adapted the existing scheme. We then piloted it, lots of teething problems, things we still needed to work on. We then tested it against the existing scheme, and we've actually had some very promising physiological results, where we've had them in the labs doing VO2 tests, and some promising results in terms of their artery responses as well. The next steps from that is we have a contract pending with the council to then roll this behaviour change training out across the city. So as an example, that process has taken us 4, 5, 6 years maximum. But yet we'll be changing practice at the end of it, and we know that it's feasible. We've got the data there to show that it's effective as well.
So I want to move into behaviour change interventions in a second, because it's something that is huge in my world of elite sports as well as the community. But before I do, probably my most controversial question of the day, and we've got to have one controversial one in there. And I'm going to tee this up around sports day at my kids' school. And I was there recently, and one of the events was one lap of the field. It's got to be less than 300 metres. And it broke my heart how many children couldn't run one lap of the field. And some of them were actually in tears trying to do it. I mean, I'm not sure if the most complaints that I heard were from the children being asked to run one lap of the field, or the parents who thought it was unfair to ask the children to run one lap of the field. And I just wonder, when you talk about behaviour change, are we targeting the children, or are we targeting the parents, or is it a case of both?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So what was unique about our programme, there were lots of family-based childhood obesity programmes around at the time, but we felt it really important that from the minute that family met us, it was put across as a whole family programme. So the whole family took part in the exercise together, parents as well. And we didn't force them to do it, but we spoke in a way that that's just how it is. And actually, we found that to be really valuable because there were things. My answer to your question is both. We found it to be really important that both of them attended those sessions together, because what was happening as well is they were both at the sessions, they both knew what each other had heard the practitioner tell them. So then there were no excuses when they went home, and the parents were finding that it was a really helpful backup for them when they were at home, and they were encouraging their child to eat more healthily or encouraging them to go out and play. They could then say to the child, well, think about what Goals was telling you. And it gave them a backup to make those conversations easier, because there is, particularly in childhood obesity, there's a lot of blame on parents, and there's a lot of people can be very judgmental, thinking it's the parents' fault. Now, arguably parents play a role, but I can tell you, I didn't meet one parent that wasn't trying to do the absolute best because they love their children and they were doing what they felt was best for their children. It's a very challenging process being a parent, and even if they knew what they were doing might not have been optimal, it's very difficult to change those behaviours. So it's very complex, but yeah, absolutely, we can't change children's behaviour without also involving the parents, but it also is very helpful to involve the children in that process, because there are some models out there that just intervene with the parents, but we've found through our research that there's valuable in them doing it together and supporting.
And you know, it's great fun as well doing it together too, isn't it? We've started obviously in the lockdown. You know, I'm doing PE with my kids now, and one thing we do every Monday, we've just done it today, is a Monday morning bleep test. So I just downloaded a free bleep test app. Just find 20 metres in the street, mark out a 20-metre track, and we do it. And I'm getting a bit worried, because I think my little boy's getting a bit too close for my liking, and at some point he's going to beat me. And but do you know what? It's great motivation for both of us, and it actually becomes really good, fun, quality time when, as a family, we do our PE. So I think, you know, the more we can do family-based stuff like that, probably the better it would be my take home.
Yeah.
Again, as a physiologist, a professor of human physiology, which I am these days, I don't know if I should admit this, but there's another quote that in the work of yours I was reading that I really liked, and maybe I'm moving to your world. Maybe I'm going to do a Ben Buckley and end up being in behavioural psychology, but it's this one, and it's after spending nearly 50 years researching performance physiology, Vigil had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that all the easy questions had been answered. He'd figured out the body, so now it was onto the brain. In essence, how do you actually get anyone to do all of this stuff? And I think that takes us really nicely into this behaviour change. And I know I've heard you say many times that a common mistake is thinking that education equals behaviour change. It's far more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, and well, first of all, I can't claim that quote. It's Christopher McDougall's from Born to Run, which is a very good book, actually, which starts, again, what it's talking about, which I think Greg mentioned in his chat with you, it's talking about how as humans, we are essentially built to run and to be physically active. But then absolutely, I like using that quote because it highlights to me the importance of psychology and arguing that it's all very well knowing what exercise does for us, and I think, and we know that, and we know it benefits us, but actually it's only beneficial if we can get people to adhere. So yeah, I think the problem that I hear a lot of people say, and certainly, yeah, I think people think that if we educate people better, and this relates to what we were talking about before, if we educate people better, they'll do it. Now, education is a part of it, yes. It's important to promote evidence-based clear information. But essentially, I mean, you said it yourself earlier, if it was just about education, nobody would smoke.
Yeah.
And we're talking about even something like exercise, physical activity, is a complex behaviour in itself. Just knowing that it's good for us isn't going to get us out that door to do it every day. And this is where I'm interested. I mean, I guess if I was to sum up my research question I'm trying to answer in research and applied practice is, how can we help people become physically active and crucially stay physically active? I think we've got lots of good examples of it's not difficult to get people active for 12 weeks. But actually, how do we help people really? I want to help people create that relationship with physical activity where they feel it's part of them and they feel it's with them for life. And that's not so easy.
Yeah. You know, I see in my world of nutrition a lot where I call it the rise of the infographic, where people think that nutrition education maybe is, but they think that nutrition interventions are, let's go into a sports team and we'll put an infographic on the wall about how to eat healthily, and just think that will translate into a behavior change. And unfortunately, it just doesn't. And it's a complex field, isn't it? Because even at the very highest standard where I work with international athletes, we still sit down as a team saying, how can we get player X to change their behavior? You know, how can we get them to start eating more in a way that we believe will optimize their performance? And it's a lot more complex than just education, which moves us nicely into theoretical models. Now, I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes, which is an Einstein one here, which is that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And one of my issues I've always said with every field, my own field of physiology and psychology and everyone, is I think we want to show off by writing complex. And, you know, you sent me some nice papers to read on self-determination theory. And I'm afraid as a professor of physiology, I still don't get it. I still can't get my head around what it actually means. And some of the terminology I thought was quite hard to get our head around when I start thinking about what chances lay public. So can we start off, Paul? Just tell me a bit about self-determination theory that me as a simple physiologist can get my head around, please.
Yeah, well, I will do, and I don't worry about that as well. I know when I first read it, I know it probably took me several times of reading it before I even embraced trying to learn it more. And I'm a psychologist, so I get it, and I think, but actually, yeah, now I spend my life talking about it because I think, yeah. Okay, so the traditional thinking, self-determination theory is a theory of motivation. Traditional thinking about motivation was that there's good and there's bad motivation. So good motivation is intrinsic motivation that comes from within. So we're just doing it because we want to do it. Bad motivation was seen as extrinsic motivation, where we're doing something for a reward. But where self-determination theory has taken us beyond that is it suggested that essentially it's suggesting rewards aren't always a negative thing. It depends on the nature of that reward and the relationship of that reward with us. So, for example, somebody might be working towards a medal or somebody might be working towards achieving a 10K race. They're all types of rewards, but those rewards might be really personally meaningful to them and something that they want to achieve. That's quite different to if somebody is coercing you into doing something and paying you for doing it.
Okay.
So what self-determination theory is, it suggests that it's the quality of our motivation that matters, not how much motivation we have. And it suggests that motivation exists on a continuum from being very controlled, coercive, essentially we're just doing something because somebody's paying us to do it or forcing us to do it, or it's the rules, it's the law, up to intrinsic motivation at the other end, which is that I kind of call it that Forrest Gump moment. If you've seen Forrest Gump, you know, when he just runs and he runs and they say, why are you running? And he's like, I just felt like it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do his accent on here. But that inherent interest, enjoyment, you're doing it for that, you know, you're enjoying the feeling of moving. In between that, there are a lot of different things. And the key distinction that self-determination theory makes is between controlled motivation, which is when we feel we have to do something, we feel a pressure to do something. So that pressure could come from either external people, your coaches, your doctors, exercise practitioners, or it can also come internally. I think this is something you can relate to if you're a perfectionist. I think I often give the example of academic work as well. If you're a perfectionist, if you're always somebody that had to get the top grades, else you didn't feel worthwhile if you weren't doing that, you know, sometimes we can put so much pressure on ourselves that we feel we have to do it, and then somebody asks you to step back and say, hang on, why do you have to do it? And you realize it's only you putting that pressure on yourself. So both those types of motivation, essentially, if you feel you have to do it and you feel a pressure, that's called controlled motivation.
Yeah.
The other more positive type of motivation is autonomous motivation, which is where we feel like our behavior is determined within. It's something that we've made the active choice to do. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to enjoy it, but it means that it holds some personal meaning for us. So it might be that we've made the active decision to lose weight because it's really important for us to lose weight because we want to be around in the future, be healthy, to play with our children.
Yeah.
Or it might be that we're working towards a particular goal, like it's really important for us to achieve that place in the national running championships, because it's important to us. Or it might be that we're intrinsically motivated and we enjoy it. So what the research shows, not surprisingly, is that if people are autonomously motivated, so they feel they want to do it, so rather than feeling they have to do it, they're much more likely to keep that behaviour up in the long term, and they're much more likely to experience a positive well-being. Whereas if their motivation is predominantly controlled, they are much likely to drop out, to stop the behaviour, or if it's predominantly that internally controlled motivation where they're pressure on themselves. So if we're only exercising for that reason, this then has we might keep exercising, but it has a negative effect on your well-being, because you're doing it primarily through guilt or primarily to prove yourself to others or for your own ego. So are you with me so far?
I'm with you so far, yes, I'm getting that, yeah. I've got lots of questions building from it, but I'm with you so far.
Okay, so the important thing about this, so as practitioners, as coaches, as parents, as educators, we want to, now the founders of this theory, Professors Edward Deci and Rich Ryan, they would say we can't motivate somebody else, but we can create an environment to help that person motivate themselves. So our role as practitioners working with athletes or the lay public is to create an environment that helps meet. The self-determination theory suggests that we have 3 basic psychological needs. And if these needs are fulfilled, we will blossom, essentially. And those psychological needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy relates to the feeling, as I was just talking about, that feeling that you have some freedom in what you decide to do every day, that your behaviour is your choice. Now, we can see the negative impact of if autonomy is removed from us. I guess one example is if, well, at the moment, we've all had some autonomy moved from us at the moment, but people can have, you know, if somebody's a single mum, for instance, works full time, spends the rest of her time cooking meals, childcare, she might feel she has very little autonomy in her life. She might feel that everything she's doing is because she has to do it. She has no choice.
Yeah.
And you can see how that can begin to affect somebody's well-being. Competence is the second need, and competence is about our need to feel that we have an optimal challenge in our lives. Now, optimal is important. So an optimal challenge that we can overcome. So in an exercise context, it would be about making sure that you are engaging in exercise or physical activity or sport that is challenging you, but it's not so challenging that you can't achieve it.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. Again, if we imagine if that's taken away, and I use the example with my students, I say, well, imagine if either all of you on this course were finding it super easy and there was no challenge at all, you wouldn't feel that need for competence was met. Equally, if it was incredibly hard and you couldn't do any of it, your need for competence would be frustrated. So that's two of them, autonomy, competence. And the third one is relatedness. And relatedness is about that human need we have to be connected with other people. And again, in an exercise context, that might be with your peers or in sports, your teammates, also your coaches, other people in your life as well, your family, anybody that's related to that concept. So in general life, again, if we were missing the need, again, this is something that's impacting on people at the moment. If you feel that you're not connected to anybody in life, that will then, your well-being will then begin to suffer. And as I'm talking through that, you can see the relevance of all of those things at the moment that we're suffering through the lockdown situation. So I'll stop there and let you ask me some questions. But
brilliant. So my summary then is intrinsic motivation is always good. Extrinsic motivation can be good if it's the right type of extrinsic motivation. It probably begs a question, why in a typical education establishment do we have so much stick? So it seems like that's the bad extrinsic motivation, or most people's parenting, if you don't do this, there'll be a consequence. We need to think about them three things. I've got my notes here, by the way. I'm, autonomy, competence, and readiness. I guess the question is, if I come along and I've identified that somebody isn't that motivated, what can I do to try and build upon, I doubt I've got the skill set to make them intrinsically motivated. Or do I? Can I manipulate things to help them to become, intrinsically motive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I disagree that you don't have the skill set. You absolutely do have the skill set. And I think often our inclination is to want to jump in and fix things for people and tell people what you think they should do to become more motivated, or what you think they should do to solve that issue. But actually, a lot of the things that we do, that we can do to support these psychological needs, are often just, well, I go through some of the strategies now, but they're things that don't require special psychology qualifications or special exercise qualifications. It's about, so if you take those, it's about thinking about that person's three needs. And I find this quite useful, actually, because if you were working with an athlete and if you notice that they're unmotivated, or they've been down recently, or they're not adhering to something that you want them to do, they're not following your diet, you might be able to see yourself, actually, if you think about, okay, put yourself in their shoes. How autonomous do you think they're feeling now? How competent do you think they're feeling now? How related do you think they're feeling now? That will probably give you some insight into what's potentially going wrong. So, for instance, it might be that you've just told them to, if you've just told them to do this diet and you haven't explained to them, they don't really understand why they're doing it, they're just doing it because you're asking, it could be that they're lacking that autonomy in that process. That's just an example. I'm not suggesting you do that, Graeme, but it's just an example. So that could be one starting point, but you can do that by asking them questions about, so to find out where the motivation is going wrong, you might start by asking them questions about why they don't feel that they're sticking to it. And with those 3 needs in mind, you can tailor your questions to think about if anything is getting in the way. But on a more positive note, I mean, I guess I've started that with coming through, okay, what if something's going wrong? As a general rule of thumb, to enhance people's psychological needs, now often the strategies overlap. So to enhance people's autonomy, what we want to do as a coach or practitioner or parent is to try and help that person see personal meaning in what you're asking them to do. And you can do that through things like asking them questions. So, okay, how do you think it would feel? Imagine if you did do this, how do you think it might feel in 2 weeks? So imagine if you did achieve this, if you did manage to lose this amount of weight, how do you think it would feel to be at the end of that? And you can do things like offering them choice. Now, some practitioners might be, but if we offer them choice, they might do things nothing like what we want them to do. So you can offer it as guided choice. So if you know there's 2 different types of diet, which might allow you to meet the same goal, you could suggest to them, okay, so there's 2 ways we can do this, lay them out to them and ask them which would fit best with their lifestyle. So it's really not rocket science stuff, but it's about, the autonomy is about involving them in that goal setting process so that they feel ownership of that goal, which it may well be something you're doing anyway.
Yeah. Good. So building on from that, Paula, motivation comes and goes, though, doesn't it? So we may have done all that. And I just think of dry January as an example.
Yeah.
How many people haven't even got through week 1 on dry January, or New Year's resolutions, which I think I read that most of them don't get out of January, a New Year's resolution. So we often start with good intentions, don't we? And then they fall by the wayside. Is there anything as a practitioner, as a coach, we can do, A, to motivate people? Well, you've said some tips we can do to me, but to give us a best chance of that sticking into habit and into a long-term practice?
So yeah, so this is another problem or challenge in motivation, really, isn't it? And it's once people feel motivated to make that change, it's actually how do they make it actually happen in practice. So we know that there's often a big gap between intentions and behaviour, and everybody, I mean, we'll all have had good intentions to do things that don't happen for ages, and it's how do we make that actually happen. Now, the research on behaviour change strategies shows, again, this isn't rocket science, but it shows one of the most solid ways to make yourself actually do something and turn that intention to practice is to set yourself a very specific action plan and to self-monitor how you get on with it. So I'm sure if you've ever trained for anything, if you've followed set your own training plan for something, you will have written down what you're going to do and when. You might tick off it as you go, and you're much more likely to do it if you haven't done that. So it's really kind of a combination of what I was saying before about people jumping into these New Year's resolutions that perhaps it might not really have that greater personal meaning for them, so they might not have thought that much about why they want to do it in the first place. And as that drops off and other things become more important, it goes by the wayside. But B, they might not also have done anything to actually help them put it into practice. If we just say we're going to do something, but we don't actually put any concrete plans into place to do it, we won't do it. And that sounds so simple, yeah. But actually, how many people actually do that with their New Year's resolutions?
No, most of us don't know. And I think it's exactly what we try and do in elite sport, where we try and actually set targets, regularly keep checking it, try and give players some ownership as well. So I think a lot of that theory we do try and do in practice, but it's certainly clarified a few things for me. In elite sport at the moment, there's a huge push on this COM-B model of behaviour change, where we're told to assess someone's capability, opportunity, and then motivation. Now, part of that model really makes sense to me, because I understand if somebody isn't doing a behaviour change because we're not capable, I need to educate, and that's maybe oversimplified. Or the opportunity often isn't there. We might have I'm thinking of youth players who we're trying to set to eat more, and we're in boarding school where they're not allowed to have any more than the standard school dinners. So we've been telling them to eat more, but they've not had the opportunity. So that is a barrier to behaviour change. I guess it all, with me, often falls down on that motivation. What do you think of the COM-B model when it comes to behaviour change? Is it one that you think we should spend a bit of time researching and using?
I think what I really like about COM-B is that it captures, we've said behaviour is complex, and it captures the multi-layered influences on our sport behaviour, our exercise behaviour, our physical activity. And, it pulls people like me back as well, who can be guilty as a psychologist of just focusing on the motivation and the perceived capability, the psychological element. It reminds us that there are also, take physical activity as an example, opportunity is a huge thing. And some of the parents and children, some of the families we worked with in Goals were living in deprived areas of Liverpool. And the reasons that they were saying they weren't going out to exercise were because they were scared of the local gun culture. It was at the time where, I don't know if you remember, but a young lad was caught in the crossfire in Liverpool.
I do remember, yeah.
2009. These kids were all the same age, living in the same place as that kid. These are real things. So us suggesting that they go for a jog down the street, you don't jog down the street, or you didn't in those days in Anfield. Yeah. So I think we can become detached from. So what I like about the COM-B model is it reminds us that there's this wider context and these other issues that, regardless, that we all need to take into consideration. Where I find it less useful, although the wider literature does talk about planning interventions, but I find it less. I find it useful in helping decide where to target your efforts with a particular individual. Okay. So if you're working with an individual, you can see, well, what is it? The same way as I said about the 3 psychological needs, you can see, well, what is it that's holding them back? Like your child gave the example of, it's opportunity. That's where we need to intervene there. Whereas someone else, it might be mainly motivation. So I think it's helpful in that sense. But I think, like the intention of it is that it then would be used with things like Susan Mickey also did the calorie taxonomy and the behaviour change technique taxonomy, so that you then use behaviour change techniques to help address those aspects. But the reality is, and particularly in the physical activity world, often some of us, we don't, if I'm running an individual level intervention, I don't have the resources or the capacity or the power to make a difference to a lot of these people's opportunities. So sometimes we're just got to focus on the controllables and the aspects that we can focus on to make a bit of a difference, but acknowledge we can't necessarily change the whole world.
I can see we're coming up to the hour mark. There's a couple of other things I just want to touch on. Honestly, I could talk about this all day, because I've realised that it's a major limitation in my skill set, something I am working hard on from my applied practice about the behaviour change. But I'm thinking about lockdown now, and I know there's one principle that you've sent me some information on, which I think is called the scarcity principle, which is whereby if something's in limited demand, we want it more. And I think we can all relate to that. I've seen a load of people commenting at the moment that never seen as many people out running, and that's probably because we're allowed to run once a day. So everybody wants to go running in that 1 hour per day. I think about Joe Wicks at the moment, how many children and adults are now doing more exercise than ever, because in this 1 hour period a day, Joe Wicks is doing some exercise. And if we don't do it now, we won't get a chance to do it. Is there anything we can learn from that for when lockdown is over? Is anything from the scarcity principle that might help us to become more motivated? Do we need to almost come up with limited windows that we should be training in? Or am I barking up the wrong tree here?
Well, To be honest, I don't know. I found it really, and I think that's been one of the, I mean, there are a few positive things potentially coming out of this, and it's been very positive to see government framing the language like you can go out once a day to exercise. So it's almost helping to reframe like it is a benefit, and it is, although we've all been saying that for years, obviously, but it is a benefit, it is a luxury. So initially, you know, psychologically, I'm thinking, is this going to make people see it different? However, I honestly think, I know we're seeing a lot more people out, but what we don't know is who those people are and whether those people were already active in other ways. And I did a quick search of the literature because I know people are, you know, a lot of hot fire literature coming out about COVID at the moment. Did a quick search to see if anything's been published on physical activity. And the only study I could find was interviewing people who were already active. So it had been displaced. So what I'm really, I guess, unsure about, and unfortunately a bit not overly optimistic about, is whether it makes any difference to those people who are inactive, most at risk with health conditions, who are not doing anything anyway. I'm not sure that scarcity principle, I don't know, but it's a struggle to reach them to ask those questions at the moment because they've probably got more pressing concerns as well. So I don't mean to sound negative about that, but I do, in principle, yes. But
and I guess, Paul, that relates to like Samuel Gray's quote, doesn't it, when he defended his choice to write him a Daily Mail, you know, saying that you're not going to solve health inequalities by writing for the Guardian. And I guess it's getting out of this echo chamber a little bit, isn't it? That, you know, you've put a survey out, but it probably went to people who are active. You know, unfortunately, I would imagine a lot of people who are going to watch this interview with you have already got this interest in it. So I guess my final question is going to be, what can we do? How do we get the message out to the right people about the importance of physical activity, and what can we all do as a sports science, sports psychology community to help?
It's a good question, and I'm always asking myself this all the time. I run around most of the time while I'm doing parkrun. I've got all these thoughts going through my head, and one of the things I thought, this isn't the answer you're expecting or very practicable, but I'm thinking we need to get on programs like EastEnders and stuff, and we need to get it embedded into that. And, you know, but essentially we need to think. Well, it's not really a joke. I actually was thinking that we could do with getting parkrun on EastEnders because we want to think about where the people go who we're trying to reach. And actually, I do think that's challenging at the moment while we're in this purely online environment, because I've obviously done quite a lot of research with hard to reach communities and with changing behaviours of low socioeconomic groups, British, Black and ethnic minority groups. But the only way we've managed to do that and really reach them is by physically going out to their communities, running programs within their communities. We need to go to them, not expect them to come to us. And I guess the same in an online and a media environment, thinking about what programs the communities watch and are engaging with. And I think it's about, I see that we all have a responsibility to get clear messages out there, and because ultimately that, to me, is what research is about. It's about changing practice, particularly in the topics that we're researching. For me, it's about how can I help more people who need it become physically active and benefit their health. So sorry, I don't have an exact answer to that, but it's going to them essentially. I
think it's a great answer, and you know, I do like the idea of engaging in mediums where it's most likely to get watched or read, and if EastEnders doing parkruns is a way to get that. Maybe we've just picked the next storyline. That could be another future for us in writing soap operas. But to try and wrap this up, I've taken, like I say, I've got a few pages of notes that I've taken from this. So from my perspective, thank you. But do you reckon we could wrap this up in 2 or 3 key points? In terms of behaviour change, but also in terms of the physical activity message that we'd like to get out there.
Okay, so we talked about several things then. So just for, I'll give a point for research and a point for individuals then.
I like that.
So they all overlap, obviously, but for researchers, I think it is It's about really thinking about the communities that we want our research to reach, and not thinking about it at the end after you've done your research, thinking about it when you start. So how can you involve them in developing that research to make sure it's meaningful and it's going to be feasible? And that's going to help the translation of your study to practice at the end.
Of course it is, yeah.
For practitioners and coaches, it's about stepping back and asking, okay, you might not have a full grasp of self-determination theory yet, but hopefully what I've said has helped. But stepping back, and rather than thinking, how can I motivate this person and fix their problem, think, how can I help this person develop their own motivation? And that is by helping them feel more autonomous, helping them feel more competent, and helping them feel more connected. Very happy for people to contact me, by the way, if you do want to talk any more about that or any more guidance on that, because I'm aware we've just brushed over the surface. And an individual, and in terms of, I guess, yeah, physical activity, the physical activity message, we didn't mention it today, but I know Greg mentioned it in your conversation, that the guidelines are 150 minutes moderate physical activity per week. But the real message is anything is better than nothing. Any movement is better than nothing. And when it comes to motivation, while self-determination theory looks complex on paper, the real message in there is not rocket science. It's essentially find something you enjoy. And if you enjoy it, you're going to keep doing it. And really, I think some of us can plow on at things thinking we have to do them, or this is the only type of exercise I can do, whereas actually there's a wealth of physical activities out there. For some people, it might just be that walking is what they love doing, or for you, bleep tests in the street. But actually, it's about finding something you enjoy and then using those behaviour change strategies like setting yourselves action plans and monitoring to turn your intentions into action to make it happen.
Yeah, I love that take-home message of finding the fun. It's something I've thought about a lot, about how much when I was younger I enjoyed playing games, whether it be squash, tennis, badminton, always what you did at school, and then suddenly you stop playing games. And I watch my kids play, and it's no wonder that they just play, they just run everywhere, they bounce everywhere, and I think finding the fun is a really key message, and maybe looking back to what you used to find enjoyable and take it up again, whether that's five-a-side football or anything. And it's the same with nutrition. It's very hard to take somebody from having 4 takeaways a day and 20 beers a night into eating salad and vegetables. But we can drop to 2 takeaways a day and 10 beers a night. Absolutely. And we can move in the right direction. And I think that's my biggest message to anyone. It's just any step in the right direction is a good step. Congratulate yourself and don't beat yourself up about you're not fully there. Be proud that you're moving in the right direction.
Absolutely, yeah.
So look, Paul, I've really enjoyed that. I enjoyed doing the reading that I had to do for this conversation, and
very well.
And it's something I'm going to continue, and it's also something that offline I want to pick up more with you and see how I can increase my skill set to become a better practitioner. So massive thank you, and I hope everyone enjoyed it, and catch you for a coffee soon.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. Sorry it was so long.
That was brilliant. I loved it. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.